Okay, I admit it was me.
Thank you.
Now that was Julie!
Welcome to Into the Vault, the movie review series where I dive into the good, the bad, and the bizarre corners of the Disney film empire, one randomly chosen title at a time. In this time, the randomizer has launched us straight into orbit with a lesser known slice of 1997 sci fi comedy, RocketMan. No, not the Elton John musical biopic, and no, not even the obscure 1954 sci fi comedy The Rocket Man, which, fun fact, actually was made by 20th Century Fox, now under Disney's ever growing media empire. I'm talking about the other Rocket Man, the Disney one, the one with zero gravity and even less shame. Released on October 10th, 1997, Rocket Man stars Harland Williams as Fred Randall, a clumsy computer programmer who accidentally stumbles into NASA's first manned mission to Mars. Directed by Stuart Gillard and produced by Walt Disney Pictures, this movie is an explosive cocktail of slapstick humor, outer space shenanigans, and fart jokes that somehow defy both gravity and good taste. It didn't exactly ignite the box office or sweep the award circuit, but it did leave an impression on many 90s kids, linking space exploration with absurd comedy and a whole lot of flatulence based humor. Before we blast off, let's take a quick look at how this film landed with critics and audiences. Reception wise, Rocket Man didn't soar. It barely achieved liftoff. It actually lost money, earning just $15 million against a reported $16 million budget. Rotten Tomatoes give it a rocky 24% from critics, while audiences were slightly kinder at 53%. Over on Metacritic, it hovers around 36 out of 100. Not a mission success, but still remembered by some for its offbeat energy and nostalgia factor. Surprisingly, Roger Ebert gave it a glowing 3 out of 4 stars, praising Harlan Williams' performance and calling it cheerfully zany. For fans of offbeat 90s comedies, it's become a nostalgic treasure quoted more often than anyone cares to admit. So, what is it actually about? When an unexpected vacancy opens on NASA's Mars mission, Fred Randall, a brilliant but wildly immature programmer, finds himself rocketing into space alongside a no nonsense commander, a stoic scientist, and a highly trained chimpanzee. What follows is part fish out of water comedy, part sci fi absurdity, and entirely nonsensical. Let's dive into Rocket Man. We open with young Fred Randall pretending his washer is a spaceship. A quick PSA. Please don't climb into washers at home, kids. Space travel is safer. Fred starts spinning inside, thankfully protected by a helmet until his mom rescues him. Cue his dad, the perfect 90s stereotype, questioning why his son isn't playing football like a normal kid. Clearly, sports are the only valid childhood hobby. Fast forward 23 years to NASA's Mars simulation. Everything's going wrong and everyone dramatically dies. Turns out it's just a test, and NASA needs to talk to the programmer responsible for the glitchy software. Enter Fred Randall, now played by Harlan Williams, a bumbling genius whose childlike enthusiasm, erratic energy, and unpredictable physical comedy make him equal parts endearing and exhausting. Fred is the kind of character who seems to operate entirely on impulse. He's brilliant with computers, but socially oblivious and often completely unaware of how his actions affect others. His naive optimism borders on delusion, and while his antics are intended to be harmless, they frequently result in chaos. Fred embodies that accidental hero trope, someone who's too clueless to realize they're in over their head, yet somehow manages to bumble his way into saving the day, often by sheer dumb luck. After a quick round of retro gaming at his workstation, he realizes he's not alone and immediately fanboys over the astronauts. They are Commander William Wild Bill Overbeck, a grizzled and no nonsense pilot with a short fuse, Gary Hackman, the smug by the book mission computer specialist, and Paul Wick, the high strung flight director. Fred enthusiastically greets them like the childhood heroes, blissfully unaware of their annoyance. When he loads the Mars simulation data into the computer to prove the software works perfectly, the results go hilariously and dangerously off the rails. Gary, ever the skeptical technician, refuses to believe Fred's theory that the problem lies in their interpretation of the software, not the program itself. To prove his point, Gary arrogantly re-enters the exact coordinates into the simulator while Fred looks on nervously. Sure enough, the software kicks in and a miniature model of the Mars lander begins spinning wildly out of control. Before anyone can react, the model zips across the room and smacks Gary squarely in the head with comical yet surprisingly brutal force. He drops like a sack of potatoes, and the chaos leaves him with a skull fracture. The scene is cartoonish in its delivery, but oddly violent in consequence, firmly setting the tone for Fred's knack for accidental destruction. Naturally, Fred insists the issue wasn't with his programming. Instead, he blames user error and shoddy math. With NASA desperate to avoid delaying their mission due to Martian sandstorms, Fred becomes their unlikely last hope. Fred immediately behaves like a distracted toddler at NASA, wandering off, meeting a chimpanzee named Ulysses, and trying unsuccessfully to impress geologist Julie Ford, a no-nonsense and highly intelligent mission specialist with a dry wit and deep knowledge of planetary geology. When Fred tries to make small talk with her, it goes downhill almost immediately. Attempting to impress her with his interstellar knowledge, he launches into a wildly unscientific monologue about the dangers of Martian life forms, particularly the mythical Martian crust devils with their venomous feet and wet, sucking lips. Julie stares in disbelief as if trying to decide whether to be horrified or amused. Julie, ever the professional, doesn't indulge him, though. She does look mildly entertained, in a this guy is not going to make it to launch day sort of way. As Fred tries to carry his suitcase out the door with exaggerated confidence, his mother fusses over him like he's heading off to his first sleepover instead of a high-stakes Mars mission. She insists he takes his peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, lovingly cut into stars and moons, naturally, and frets about him remembering to wear clean socks. Fred, torn between embarrassment and comfort, half-heartedly accepts her care package, reinforcing his identity as a man-child stuck somewhere between space genius and cleaning-only son. The whole interaction is both hilarious and a little sad, giving us a clearer picture of a man who can build spaceflight algorithms, but still lives in his childhood bedroom. To celebrate his impending mission, Fred heads to the on-base bar, which, because this is a Disney space comedy, is thematically named Blastoff. Inside, Commander Bill offers to buy Fred a drink, introducing him to a house specialty also called a Blastoff. How original. What Fred doesn't realize is that it's a literal tower of flaming shots. Trying to play it cool, he blows out the flames and proceeds to down the entire set in one go. It's not long before the alcohol hits and Fred ends up wildly drunk, stumbling around the bar in an astronaut suit meant for decoration. He pulls Julie onto the dance floor in a bizarre attempt at bonding. Naturally, it ends with both of them falling over, and Julie, furious, reminds him that this isn't a frat party, it's NASA. She tells him to grow up or get out, and Fred, for the first time, shows a sliver of vulnerability, admitting he just wanted to fit in. It's a rare human moment buried beneath a lot of cartoonish behavior. Fred's training montage begins with an isolation chamber endurance test against Gordon Peacock, another astronaut candidate. While Gordon attempts to remain stoic and composed in silence, Fred spends the hours yodeling, conversing with his echo, and eventually launching into an endless singing of John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt, over and over. What starts as quirky quickly transforms into a psychological torture. As Gordon unravels from Fred's unrelenting stream of nonsense by the end of the 24 hours, Gordon is a twitching wreck while Fred cheerfully asks for a few more minutes to finish his sock puppet routine. Next comes the G-force test. Before Fred even steps into the centrifuge, Commander Bill warns him that this won't be as easy as the isolation chamber and tells him to have fun. Fred responds with a joke that lands with the force of a lead balloon, and not just because it's unfunny. He says, "Fun is my Chinese neighbor's middle name." A line that's both dated and cringe-inducing, even by late 90s standards. It's one of those moments that makes you pause and wonder how this passed through multiple drafts of a script and still made it into the final cut. Trying to shake off the awkwardness, Fred straps in, determined to beat Commander Bill's long-standing G-force record. He eagerly encourages the engineers to crank it faster, higher, and wilder, until inevitably, the machine violently malfunctions, bolts fly off, alarms blare, and Fred is launched from the chamber like a human pinball. He rockets down a hallway, zips past a nun leading a group of stunned children, and slams into poor Gary, who is still recovering in a wheelchair. The impact flips Gary's chair, sending him into a short spin before landing upright, only to tip over again with a perfect unfortunate timing. The whole scene should be slapstick gold, but the painfully bad CGI and awkward editing undercut the punchline. What should feel like a polished comedic set piece ends up playing more like an unfinished special effect reel from a mid-tier amusement park ride. It's physical comedy without finesse, and it's clear the filmmakers were banking on chaos to carry the joke rather than craftsmanship. After that catastrophe, Fred tackles a circuit board wiring test designed to simulate fixing a critical system failure mid-flight. He nails the dry run with impressive speed, finally earning some quiet respect from the NASA staff. But then comes the real test, completing the same task under pressure. This time the chair spins erratically while alarms blare and lights flash, simulating a full-blown spacecraft emergency. Fred freezes, overwhelmed by the chaos, and fails the task entirely, foreshadowing a pivotal moment later in the film. In his final physical trial, Fred faces a lung capacity test designed to simulate surviving an oxygen tank failure. Using a breathing tube, he successfully suspends a ping pong ball in the air, so well in fact that he shatters the facility record. But naturally, it doesn't end smoothly. Fred accidentally inhales the ball mid-test and immediately begins choking, triggering a chaotic scene. With a loud gasp, he violently coughs it back up, sending it ricocheting around the room in classic slapstick fashion. It eventually smacks Gordon Peacock squarely in the head. Again. Poor Gordon, who has already endured a more than his fair share of Fred's related disasters, is once again the unwilling target of his colleagues' collateral damage. At this point, the man deserves hazard pay and probably a therapist. Fred's crew announcement press conference is everything you'd expect from him, as NASA calmly announces him as the final member of the Mars mission. Fred lets out a high-pitched scream of excitement, knocks over several chairs, barrels his way through the crowd, and nearly tackles the podium just to wave at the cameras. Reporters are stunned, officials are horrified, and somewhere in the back, someone definitely facepalms. After this overly enthusiastic spectacle, Fred prepares for liftoff, though not without one last surprisingly heartfelt moment. Before heading to the shuttle, he has a quiet conversation with Bud Nesbitt, the legendary astronaut he idolizes. Bud tells Fred a story about receiving 3 commemorative coins from the President Johnson during the Apollo era, one each for wisdom, strength, and bravery. With a look of reluctant optimism, Bud hands Fred the coin for bravery, telling him he's going to need it out there. Fred, clearly moved, awkwardly jokes that he feels more like the cowardly lion, even breaking into a short rendition of "If I Were King of the Forest." Bud smiles and simply tells him, "Just say thank you." It's one of the few moments where Fred appears genuinely humbled. As he boards the shuttle, still clutching the bravery coin Bud Nesbitt gave him during their quiet pre-launch chat, Fred tries to stay composed, but of course that doesn't last. As the launch sequence begins, he panics and starts shouting random acronyms, yelling out IHOP, AT&T, KFC, instead of the actual NASA callouts. It's clear that Fred is completely overwhelmed and he's handling it in the only way he knows how, by leaning into total nonsense. Moments before liftoff, he loudly announces that he has to tinkle, which adds an extra layer of tension no one asked for. When the launch finally happens, Fred sneezes mid-blast off, yanking off his helmet in the process, and nobody seems remotely concerned. I guess safety protocols were optional. Once in space, things go downhill quickly. Fred, in an attempt to bond with his crew, prepares space meals, only to mix up the labeled tubes. Julie ends up eating what was clearly labeled as toothpaste, Bill receives a helping of hemorrhoid cream, and Fred unknowingly consumes the laxative. And because this is Fred we're talking about, the consequences are immediate and disastrous. This leads to one of the film's most infamous scenes, the toilet incident. When trying to use the zero-gravity toilet, Fred drops the commemorative coin Bud Nesbitt gave him and reaches in to retrieve it, just as the system flushes. He's sucked into the vacuum, tossed around like a sock in a dryer, and emerges blue from head to toe covered in cleaning chemicals. It's at that exact moment the shuttle receives a scheduled globally televised transmission, a live broadcast with the President of the United States. Mortified but fully aware of how ridiculous he looks, Fred wanders into the frame during the live broadcast, still stained blue from his zero-gravity toilet misadventure. The crew and mission control freeze in horror as he unintentionally becomes the face of NASA's biggest moment. looking like a Smurf who crash landed in a bleach factory. With all eyes on him, Fred enthusiastically waves to the world, blissfully oblivious to the situation. It's a moment of pure secondhand embarrassment and a perfect example of how Fred consistently stumbles into center stage at the worst possible time. The president asks what happened, and Fred replies with inspiring gibberish about feeling like he can hold the whole world in his hands. Then, for reasons unknown to science or script logic, he bursts into song, launching into He's Got the Whole World in His Hands in a parade of fake accents. The president joins in, the NASA mission control joins in, then the entire world, apparently watching the broadcast live, joins in. What was meant to be a unifying global moment quickly devolves into a parade of uncomfortable cultural stereotypes and off-key harmonizing that leaves you equal parts bewildered and secondhand embarrassed. Fred's relationship with Julie awkwardly blossoms over a shared love of stars, an overly convenient moment that seems less like character development and more like a contractual obligation to include a romantic subplot. Of course, Disney couldn't resist a shoehorned When You Wish Upon a Star reference. As Fred gazes out at the cosmos, waxing poetic about his childhood wish upon Fred's star, Julie coincidentally reveals that she had a childhood star of her own, placed conveniently next to Fred's. The implication? These two were always destined to meet, presumably to dance awkwardly in zero gravity. That's foreshadowing if you didn't know. Back in the pod bay, Fred prepares to enter hypersleep like the rest of the crew. But just as he's about to climb into his assigned chamber, Ulysses beats him to it. The chimp locks himself inside and promptly falls asleep, leaving Fred without a pod that fits his size. Fred tries to squeeze into Ulysses' smaller chamber, but it's designed for a much smaller occupant, and the lid won't close. After a few failed attempts and a lot of flailing, Fred accepts the truth. He's going to be the only person awake for the entire 8-month journey. Fred climbs out of his bunk after what he believes has been 8 long months of hypersleep, only to check the clock and realize it's been a grand total of 13 minutes. That harsh reality hits like a meteor to the face. With no functioning pod to return to and the rest of the crew still frozen in hypersleep, Fred is left completely alone aboard the spaceship. The silence, vastness, and lack of social interaction start to wear on him almost immediately. As the days stretch on, Fred begins to unravel. He awkwardly exercises to keep busy, talks to himself in increasingly manic log entries, and eventually turns his boredom and isolation into an outlet for expression by painting an enormous mural across the interior of the ship. The mural is a parody of Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam, starring himself, Ulysses, and Julie in place of the biblical figures. The longer Fred is alone, the more eccentric he becomes, spiraling into isolation-induced madness that toes the line between comedy and existential crisis. Upon arrival on Mars, Fred stumbles, literally, into history by accidentally becoming the first person to set foot on the Red Planet. Commander Bill, suited up and ready to make the iconic descent, is moments away from stepping out when Fred slips and stumbles down the ladder, landing face first into Martian soil. It's a scene played for laughs, but one that visibly crushes Bill's dreams of making history. Trying to salvage the moment, Fred attempts to plant the American flag, only to hurl it into the Martian trench. Thinking quickly and disastrously, he pulls off his American flag boxers and hoists them onto the flagpole instead, officially marking Mars with dignity levels that NASA never anticipated. As the team begins exploring the Martian surface, Fred and Bill are assigned the task of planting instruments and collecting samples while Julie monitors from the lander. Mission Control notices a problem. Bill's oxygen tank is leaking due to a cracked valve. He's forced to tether his suit to Fred's backup supply in order to avoid suffocating. Bill, already annoyed at having to rely on Fred, warns him to conserve oxygen. Fred tries to comply, but his usual chatter begins, prompting Bill to sternly remind him again. Then it happens. Fred lets out a massive fart, still unaware of the consequences of the shared air supply. The methane rushes through the tether line and directly into Bill's suit. Bill immediately begins gagging and flailing while Mission Control, watching his vital spike, starts laughing uncontrollably as it realizes what just happened. One technician even calls out, "His methane levels are off the charts." As chaos erupts back on Earth, it's one of the film's most infamous and juvenile moments, highlighting just how far it's willing to go for a cheap laugh. Meanwhile, Julie realizes the Martian windstorms are arriving earlier than expected and urges everyone to begin preparations for departure. Mission Control confirms her fears and recommends immediate withdrawal. Bill, however, still irritated by Fred's blunders and determined to make a worthwhile discovery, insists on pressing forward. He's particularly focused on locating a unique geological formation that Ulysses was trained to identify. Against Julie's objections, Bill decides to conduct one last scouting trip with the chimpanzee. Later that night, Fred overhears Mission Control attempting to reach Bill with no response. Julie wakes up to find the rover gone and both Bill and Ulysses missing. The tension rises as she and Fred realize they ventured alone into the intensifying storm. The situation shifts from comic misadventure to genuine peril, setting the stage for Fred's most selfless act of the film. Before heading into the storm, Fred has a brief exchange with Bud Nesbitt via Mission Control. Bud, now a voice of experience and regret, shares a painful memory. He confesses that during Apollo 13 he didn't make the right call, and if things had gone wrong, it would have been his fault. Bud tells Fred that this time he is making the right decision. It's a poignant moment of mentorship and validation, giving Fred the courage he needs to charge into danger. Fred suits up and ventures into the storm to find them, braving the intense winds and limited visibility while radioing Mission Control. He begins calling out for Ulysses, and miraculously, the chimp calls back. They reunite, but Bill is nowhere in sight. Fred and Ulysses stumble blindly through the dust until they hear Bill's voice. He's trapped under the rover and can't move. Bill, knowing the danger, tells Fred to abandon the rescue and save himself, but Fred refuses. He struggles and finally manages to lift the rover just enough for Bill to crawl out. Meanwhile, Julie informs Bud Nesbitt at Mission Control that she's initiating the launch sequence, adding urgency to the already tense situation. As they're making their way towards the shuttle, Fred notices that Ulysses is beginning to pass out. Without hesitation, he hooks his own oxygen tank into the chimp's suit and tells Bill not to worry. He holds the record for lung capacity, after all. But Fred quickly becomes disoriented and loses his way in the storm. Realizing Fred hasn't returned, Bill turns around, finds him collapsed in the dust, and drags him back to the lander. Julie performs CPR on Fred, reviving him in the middle of what turns into their first kiss. Gasping back to life, Fred immediately begins giving CPR to Ulysses, determined not to let anyone down. Nonetheless, Fred's heroism earns him a rare moment of genuine respect from Bill, who finally acknowledges that despite everything, Randall showed up when it mattered most. The lander takes off and they escape the Martian storm, but just when it seems like the danger is over, disaster strikes again. Rocks from the storm begin slamming into the Pilgrim, causing a critical failure. The shuttle loses power and begins to plummet into free fall. It's total chaos, alarms blaring, systems failing, and the only hope of recovery lies in rewiring the main controls within 2 minutes, the very test Fred famously botched during training. At Mission Control, the head of NASA watches nervously while Bud Nesbitt delivers the line that sums up everyone's anxiety. Only a complete genius or a total fool can pull this off. Lucky for us, he's both. With the crew's fate hanging in the balance, Bud manages to reach Fred over the comms and gives him a focused pep talk, reminding him of everything he's overcome. Inspired, Fred uses the bravery coin Bud gave him to bridge a blown fuse, literally rerouting power and saving the day. Back in space with the immediate crisis behind them, Fred has one last surprise. He's crafted makeshift formal wear for himself and Julie out of space blankets, and he asks her for a dance. As When You Wish Upon a Star plays over the intercom, Bill reluctantly joins in by shining a flashlight like a spotlight. They even disabled gravity to make it more magical. The moment is as cheesy as it is charming, culminating in the inevitable kiss. As they prepare for hypersleep, everything seems finally to be in order until, of course, Ulysses climbs into the Fred's pod again, claiming the chamber for himself. The mission ends as it begins, Fred once again stuck wide awake while everyone else gets some much needed rest. So, what did I think of the movie? Honestly, this movie was not good. Fred Randall's bumbling quickly transitions from mildly amusing to borderline annoying. The few chuckles don't justify the relentless juvenile humor, which hasn't aged well, especially regarding cultural insensitivity. Commander Bill was passable overall, stern, grizzled, and a fitting foil to Fred's chaotic energy. He spends most of the film annoyed, exasperated, and barely tolerating Fred's presence, which makes the moment where he shows grudging respect all the more satisfying. However, the spotlight scene near the end where he helps set up the zero gravity dance by shining a flashlight like a stage light felt oddly out of character. It's a tonal shift that doesn't quite line up with the previously no-nonsense demeanor, making it seem like the writers couldn't decide if Bill was supposed to be a hardened veteran or a closet romantic. Julie and Fred's romance was entirely unnecessary, feeling forced rather than earned. Their chemistry is minimal, and the relationship progression feels more like a checkbox for a romantic subplot than something naturally developed. The zero-gravity dance and kiss may aim for charm, but it comes off as awkwardly placed and emotionally unearned. Meanwhile, Ulysses the Chimp, despite being heavily featured early on, gradually fades into the background. He ends up serving more as a convenient plot device, popping in when the writers needed a cute gag or a sudden complication, then vanishing without explanation for entire stretches of the film. One of the biggest culprits dragging RocketMan down is its visual presentation. The CGI and special effects are often laughably bad. From visibly awkward wirework during zero-gravity scenes to Martian landscapes that feel like green screen backdrops from a mid-90s educational CD-ROM, the film never manages to sell its sci-fi setting. Instead of drawing you into space, the effects constantly remind you that you're watching a soundstage desperate pretending to be the cosmos. While Rocket Man might hold some nostalgia charm for viewers who remember it from their childhood, modern viewers may find it tough to stomach. The film relies heavily on physical humor and lowbrow gags without ever managing to elevate them into genuine comedy. Harland Williams tries his best, but his performance ultimately feels repetitive and grating rather than endearing. The film's narrative is disjointed and often rushed, making character development and emotional moments feel shallow and unearned. By the end, you're left wondering if even the filmmakers truly believed in their own story or if they were simply banking on easy laughs. Overall, Rocketman struggles under its slapstick heavy humor, painfully dated effects, and questionably storytelling choices. It's a nostalgia fueled oddity rather than a comedy classic. But hey, not every movie can shoot for the stars and actually reach them. And that's it for this orbital misadventure. So, what did the random picker land on next? Out of over 1,000 Disney owned titles, it gave me Spirited Away from 2002. Yes, the Oscar winning masterpiece from Studio Ghibli and director Hayao Miyazaki. This should be quite the tone shift from fart jokes and faulty G Force chairs. I'm excited to dive into one of the most visually stunning and emotionally resonant animated films ever made, so be sure to stick around for that one. Let's open the vault.